bottom half Roman, top half medieval. Now the wall is significant in our story because we're talking about the autumn of 1888, the autumn of terror, when 5, possibly 6 prostitutes, ladies of the night, were savagely murdered and mutilated by an unknown assailant, forever known as Jack the Ripper. Now, 5 of those victims were murdered beyond the wall here in Whitechapel, in the East End of London. They're often called the Whitechapel murders. But only 1 victim was murdered here in the square mile of the old city. Now, to this day, there are still 2 police forces operating here. The City of London Police Force, just here in the square mile of the old city, and the Metropolitan Police Force, Scotland Yard, in the other 600 square miles of Greater London. Like a county, really, yeah. Now, they get on pretty well these days, these police forces, but back in the 1880s, they hated each other. They wouldn't communicate or cooperate, and full of petty rivalry and jealousy. And this is said to be one of the reasons why the killer was never caught, because nobody knows the identity of Jack the Ripper. There's plenty of theories about who he may have been, which I'll go into detail about later on, and nobody really knows who he was. Now, across the way they got the Tower of London, the castle, built by William the Conqueror in 1078. Now, this also figures in our story, because the first victim, although she may not necessarily actually have been a Jack the Ripper victim, Martha Tabron, her name was. She was typical of the victims though. She was an alcoholic prostitute in her 40s. But Martha, although she had her throat cut from left to right like the others, poor Martha was stabbed 39 times, once with a bayonet. Now, of course, we're looking for Jack the Ripper, not Jack the Stabber. So she may not necessarily have been a Ripper victim, but she's always included in the story because it was the opening up of the case book on Jack the Ripper by Scotland Yard. Now, Martha, she was last seen by her friend, fellow prostitute Curly Pole, going off with a soldier in George Yard, east of here. So the police thought, oh, a soldier, a bayonet wound. We'll check out the barracks of the Tower of London, the Scots guards back there. So all the guards are lined up, and the witness, Curly Pole, she went up and down to see if she recognised anyone, which she didn't. Or perhaps she recognised everyone. Quite a few would have been her clients. So Jack the Ripper was not found to be a soldier at the Tower of London. So we're going to go now, folks, we're going to cross over another bit of the London Wall, just north of here, and we're going to cross over from the City of London into Whitechapel, scene of most of these terrible murders. Just wait back. So just going through the archway there, the old Roman wall, from the City of London into Whitechapel in the East End of London. Now let me set the scene for you back in the 1880s. If you went 3 or 4 miles west, you'd come to Buckingham Palace, then the seat of the richest and most powerful empire in the world. You come 3 or 4 miles east, it was a different world, almost a third world by today's standards. It was a terrible place, Whitechapel, full of violence, gangs, prostitution, abject poverty, the worst slums in Europe. You know, 55% of children never reached the age of 5 in this area in the 1880s. And there were up to 7 or 8 different people living in a single room in the slums of Whitechapel back then. And there were 3,000 prostitutes just here in Whitechapel, this small area. A lot of people think, Jack the Ripper was a misogynist. He hated women, particularly prostitutes. May not necessarily be the case. could just be that they were the easiest victims, you know, used to going into dark corners with a stranger at the drop of a hat. And there were plenty of prostitutes here in Whitechapel. Is that why Jack the Ripper came here? By the way, the reason this area is traditionally the poorer bit of London is because, you know, the prevailing winds in London go from the west to the east. So all the bad smells get taken to the poor people in the east. And that's literally true, while it is traditionally the poorer bit of London. Now, as regards to that name, Jack the Ripper, it seems likely now the killer never used or invented that name. It seems probable now this was the invention of an enterprising tabloid journalist called T.P. O'Connor. He was a very famous journalist at the time, and the tabloids were just getting going back then. You know, after the initial interest in the case, it did wane somewhat after the second and third murders, and it's been suggested that T.P. O'Connor concocted this mythic, folklorish name, Jack the Ripper, to capture the public imagination. And it really worked. It really entered the psyche. And it's probably, you know, one of the 3 or 4 reasons why we remember this case to this day, because of that name, Jack the Ripper. I mean, if you'd chosen Terry the Terror, it probably wouldn't quite have the same resonance, but Jack the Ripper really did it. And there's some photographs here of some of the famous letters sent to the press, taunting the police. There's the Dear Boss letter there, yours truly from hell, Jack the Ripper. Notice on this one the sort of copper plate journalistic writing. This was probably dictated by T.P. O'Connor to his assistant Frederick Best, who wrote this out. If you've been watching the TV series recently called Ripper Street, about the police force at the time of Jack the Ripper, Frederick Best is depicted as a character. He's the one with the false ear in that TV series, if you ever see that, and he's the one who probably wrote this out. I'll pass that round, madam, yeah? Now we're going to go to our next stop, which is the longest walk of the tour. It's about 4 minutes, but once we get into Ripper country, the stops are a lot closer together. We cannot do all the murder sites, 2 or 3 a bit too far east to go, and one of those doesn't even exist anymore. It was bombed in the Blitz and is now a school playground, I believe. We'll get 3 or 4 murder sites in. We cannot do them chronologically either. You know, Jack the Ripper, for all his other failings, had the marked lack of consideration not to commit a murder spree to fit in with a walking tour which leaves from the Tower of London, yeah? So I'm going to have to juggle it a bit. And as we go along, pass those cards round. Now, if you do get lumbered with one of those cards, folks, don't leave it on the step, will you? Like somebody did last week, and run back and get it. Hold on to it till we get to the next stop and give it to either Paul or myself, yeah? So, going to St Botolph's Church. The minnow is. And the 5-10 minute walk down there would take you to the Tower of London and the bus stop where we started. Now, after that first murder of Martha Tabron, which may, as I say, not necessarily have been a Ripper murder, that was on the 6th of August 1888. At the end of the month, the 31st, well, that was the first victim actually wrapped up. And again, it was a prostitute in her 40s by the name of Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly Nichols. Now, she was found murdered east of here, a bit too far east to go. It's actually opposite the London Hospital. I don't see the black chimney in the distance there. That's the top of the Royal London Hospital, which you may know, of course, from the story of the Elephant Man. You know the Elephant Man? Oh, Joseph Merrick. It's a true story. Hideously deformed man who was displayed as a freak in what is now a sari shop up Whitechapel Road opposite the hospital, till Dr. Treves, played by Anthony Hopkins, if you remember in the film, he came over and rescued him, took him back to the hospital in 1884 and looked after him there till the Elephant Man died in 1893. They've still got his skeleton in there, although Michael Jackson tried to buy it about 20 years ago, but they wouldn't let him have it. So the Elephant Man, Merrick, was actually living in Whitechapel at the time of these murders, and people have really tried to pin the murders on him. They really have. But you know, he could hardly get up the stairs, poor soul. And not only that, I think even the most unfastidious prostitute would not go into a dark corner with the Elephant Man, so we can rule him out. Yeah. Now, just behind that sari shop up there is Bucks Row, where poor Polly Nichols was found murdered and mutilated. Like Martha before, the throat was cut from left to right. But poor Polly, she was ripped up. A knife was plunged down below, brought up to the breastbone, innards exposed, entrails brought out, thrown over the left shoulder. This was the handiwork of Jack the Ripper. Just over a week later, on the 8th of September, another victim, again a prostitute in her 40s by the name of Annie Chapman, she was murdered in the very same way. That was in Hanbury Street, where I'll take you to later on. At the end of September, the 30th, well, that was the night of the double event, when there were two murders in just one night. The first, Elizabeth Stride, she was found murdered east of here. Again, too far east to go. And that's the site that doesn't even exist. It's now a school playground, so we won't go there. The second victim that night, Catherine Eddowes. She was seen talking to a man on the other side of the church there by the old Imperial Club in the early hours of the morning. This church back then, by the way, St Botolph's, was known as the prostitutes' church. Not because they went in, because the prostitutes used to encircle the church trying to pick up customers, and the police wouldn't bother them if they kept moving. So it's obviously what Catherine Eddowes was doing when she was seen talking to the man on the other side, and then she took the man across the way here behind that school to Mitre Sq, where she was found murdered and mutilated. And that's where we're going to go now. And remember folks, when we cross over here, I didn't see the blue plaque on the chemist's wall there. It says the site of the Aldgate, or East Gate. There were 6 Roman gates to the city of London, and this is the site of the Eastern Gate. That means when we cross over past that plaque, we're now going back into the city of London. This was the only murder committed in the city. This way. See where the school gates are? It's just that point there. Known as Ripper's Corner. We'll move in there later on when the other group moves out. Now, you see all the cobbles here on this picture? This picture was taken at the time of the murder here of Catherine Eddowes. These cobbles were here till last month. Oh. You're a month too late. They've been here for 250 years, yeah? And the outline of the square is known as Mitre Sq. Originally it was a monastery on this site, the Holy Trinity Monastery, and the outline went back to the 1300s. It was a cloister. You're a month too late. After 600 years, 250 years, 130 years. Make your mind up. They've ripped up these cobbles. So this is what's replaced them. So you had a bit of an atmosphere of what it was like till last month. Although the buildings had gone quite a few years ago. These buildings here, this corner here, they were like Victorian warehouses that were demolished in 1971. It was a very bad decade actually, the 1970s, for the Jack the Ripper murder sites. Now, talking about the night of the double event, remember. That was the 30th of September 1888. Now just east of here, in Duckfield Yard, well just going into Duckfield Yard off of Burner Street, my chin's kicking in, yeah, there's a Jewish salesman called Louis Dumshorts. There's Louis. He's coming home from work after a busy day selling cheap jewellery at Crystal Palace. in the early hours of the morning. He turns his horse and cart off of Berners Street into Dutfield Yard where he lived. As he goes in the yard, the horse's head rears up. There's something in the way. So Louis, he jumps off the cart and strikes a match. Quite expensive things in those days, matches, and it was a windy old night, and he knew he had just a split second to see what was in the way. So he looked down, and there he saw the body of a woman before the light was extinguished. At first, Louis, would you believe, thought the woman was his wife, drunk again. So he just starts walking indoors. But then he hears the retreating footsteps of a man, almost certainly the killer. You know, if Louis had looked upwards instead of downwards when he struck that match, he would have looked into the eyes of Jack the Ripper. The woman was Elizabeth Stride, again a prostitute in her 40s. But her throat was cut from right to left, not from left to right like the others, but there was no further mutilation. It seems the killer was disturbed, very disturbed you might say, because his bloodlust was not satiated, it wasn't satisfied, he'd only cut the throat before Louis had interrupted him. So he came here to Mitre Sq to find another victim. And this he did in Catherine Eddowes. Now Catherine Eddowes, would you believe, was actually in police custody when that first murder happened at 1 o'clock in the morning, because she had been found drunk and disorderly in Bishopsgate around the corner, and she was thrown into the Bishopsgate police station cells to sober up, which she did, and then she insisted on being set free, which was a big mistake. She came here and met Jack the Ripper. Hi there. So what we'll do first, we'll move in there because this is the only place you can now stand where a murder happened. So we'll move in just to Ripper's Corner.
Ξεχαστήκαν τώρα αυτά. Τα έχουμε πάρει. Υπήρχαν λίγες γραμμές κάτω αυτό.
Όχι, και εδώ είχαν αυτά τα κλαδάκια.
Α, το άλλαξαν.
I don't see this photograph, folks. So this is like the entrance into this gateway here. So that had been the pavement, and this is where poor Catherine Eddowes was found over there. And that was about, well, remember that first murder happened at 1 o'clock? 1:30, the local bobby on the beach along here, PC Watkins, is coming up St James's Passage where we just came up, which was much narrower in those days, and he walks across this square here. PC Watkins, he sees nothing untoward, carries on further up there along his beach. At 1:30. 1:35, a man called Joseph Lavender is coming the same way, but he goes into Mitre Passage, which is up there, which at that time looked was a much narrower alleyway. Mitre Passage. Now, Joseph Lavender, he later testified as he went into the entrance of the passageway there, he saw on the left-hand side a woman talking to a man. I'll pass those around, yeah? Yeah, the woman, Lavender, recognised as Catherine Eddowes from the clothes she was wearing in the mortuary. The man, Lavender said, was about 5'6", 7, stoutish, fair hair, brown moustache, had a salt and pepper coloured jacket, a red neckerchief like a sailor, and a grey peaked cap like a deerstalker, you know, like Sherlock Holmes. Not the sort of image you think of, is it, when you think of Jack the Ripper? You know, the folklorish image of the tall, dark figure with the top hat and cape and Gladstone bag. But that image came later. Now this description by Lavender occurs again later on in the killing spree. So it seems likely to be a good description of the killer. Lavender said the woman didn't seem particularly perturbed. She had her hand casually on the man's chest. About 1:35. 1:45, PC Watkins is coming back along his beat, and he walks across the square here, and this time he finds here, in what was then the darkest part of the square, there was just one lamp across the way, he finds here the body of Catherine Eddowes. Like before, the throat had been cut from left to right, the knife plunged down below, brought up to the breastbone, innards exposed, entrails brought out, thrown over the left shoulder. And this time there were organs missing. The uterus was missing, as was the bladder and part of the left kidney. Now there's a thick membrane you have to cut through to get through the kidney. And the killer, he seemed to know what he was looking for. And he's done this, remember, in near pitch darkness in under 10 minutes. And this has led to the speculation that perhaps the killer had medical knowledge. Now, after the murder here, Jack the Ripper, he goes eastwards back into Whitechapel. Remember, we're now in the city of London. He doesn't carry on further westwards into the city. Even in those days, it was very quiet at night time in the city of London. He goes right into the heat of the situation. There was a frenzy going on in those days about these murders. There were vigilante groups patrolling, policemen patrolling in 2s and 3s, policemen with bloodhounds, and even, would you believe, policemen dressed as prostitutes to attract Jack the Ripper. It's true, and he goes right into the very heart of that situation. Why, you may ask? Well, probably because that's where he lived. And we know he went this way because just round the corner, where I'm going to take you now, the killer left the only material clue of the whole killing spree. Got those photographs, folks, yeah? Lovely, thank you. Thanks very much, yeah. So follow me, folks, we're walking almost... Now, we've almost certainly been walking in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper. And we know that because behind me you've got the Wentworth model dwellings, built in 1886. So it's been quite new at the time of these murders. Okay, see where it says fish and chips takeaway? Yeah? That's obviously an entrance to a fish and chip shop these days, but back in 1888 this was one of the entrances to the model dwellings. And just inside there on the right hand side, about 3 o'clock in the morning on that night of the double event, another bobby on the beach, PC Long, he finds inside there a piece of blood-stained cloth. Now this was found to have come from the apron of Catherine Eddowes, murdered in Mitre Sq back there. So it seems what the killer has done is cut a piece of cloth from the apron, and then wiped his hands of the blood as he walked, where we've walked, and dumped the cloth inside there on the right hand side. As I say, the only material clue of the whole killing spree. But there may have been another clue as well, because it's gone now, but if you went on to the right hand side there was a brick wall at one time, and chalked on the wall just above the blood-stained cloth was a piece of graffiti, and this said, "The Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing. The Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing." Was this a clue left by the killer? And if so, what did it mean? Well, the word Jews as chalked on the wall there, it was spelled unusually. J-U-W-E-S. Who spells Jews like that? Apparently the Freemasons. You know the Freemasons? They're a respectable secret society, very much entrenched in the establishment, do lots of work for charity. Now, according to their mythology, the word Jews was spelt on the wall there. It was a collective noun for 3 Masons in biblical times. Jubilee, Jubilo, Jubilant. 3 Masons who were ritually executed for violating the Temple of Solomon. Executed by having their throats cut from left to right, a knife plunged down below, brought up to the breastbone, innards exposed, entrails brought out, thrown over the left shoulder. Sounds familiar? The handiwork of Jack the Ripper. Was this series of killings, were the ritual killings committed by the Freemasons? And if so, why? Well, there is a theory, it's a bit involved, so bear with me, but it's actually the most popular theory of the Jack the Ripper story. In fact, you know, the last three major movies made about the Ripper take this as their plot. And it concerns this man here, in the bottom right-hand corner, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, heir to the British throne. He should have been king, but he died young, and his brother became king instead, George V, the Queen's grandfather. Now, Prince Albert Victor was very artistic, it's an historical fact, and his mother, Princess Alexandra, this is an historical fact, she knew of a man living in this area at the time who was a great artist, a man by the name of Walter Sickert. There's Walter Sickert, his big Jack the Ripper top hat. Yeah, he's a very famous artist. You can see his work in the National Gallery in Mitre Sq to this day. Now, according to theory, the young prince was going to be sent incognito here into the East End to learn art from the master. But whilst here, so the story goes, the prince meets and falls in love with a simple shop girl by the name of Annie Crook. Now, she's a historical person. She died in a lunatic asylum in 1920. So the prince and the shop girl fall in love. Sounds like an operetta, doesn't it? And they secretly marry. Now, of course, this would have caused a scandal. You know, the heir to the British throne marrying a shop girl, a nobody. And to make matters even worse, Crook, the shop girl, was Roman Catholic. You know, until a couple of years ago, it was illegal for the heir to the British throne to marry a Roman Catholic. Like, you know, Prince William, for instance, would not have married Kate Middleton 6 years back if she had been Catholic. They've only just changed the law. So this, you know, could have brought down the monarchy. Surprisingly unpopular at the time. Queen Victoria thought of as a slacker recluse in Windsor Castle since the death of her husband Albert decades before. And to exacerbate things even further, there was a witness to this secret royal wedding, a prostitute by the name of Mary Jane Kelly, the last Jack the Ripper victim. Now she, according to theory, she with her cohorts, her fellow prostitutes, they were now blackmailing the establishment about what they knew. Now when the Prime Minister at the time, Lord Salisbury, a high-ranking Freemason, when he finds out about this, so the theory goes, he arranges to have these upstart blackmailing prostitutes murdered, hopefully discreetly. Unfortunately, the man who got to do this, Dr. William Gull, Queen Victoria's surgeon no less, and again a high-ranking Freemason, he's actually on the edge of madness at the time. And he not only murders these prostitutes, he sort of punishes them further with this ritual mutilation. As if to say, this is what happens to you if you dare confront the establishment. Well, that's the theory. It's very operatic, almost romantic, but there's no real evidence in a court of law to pin any of this down, although historical people were involved. Now, when the graffiti is discovered over there, the head of Scotland Yard, Charles Warren, again a high-ranking Freemason, he's got out of his bed in the small hours and brought down here. And what was so urgent? Did somebody recognise the significance of the spelling of the word Jews? Charles Warren, he immediately orders the graffiti to be rubbed off. If he waited an hour, there'd have been light enough to photograph it. He didn't do this. He maintained that the word Jews, however misspelt, could have caused race riots in this area at the time. It's a very Jewish area back then, and there was lots of anti-Semitism. In fact, you know, the only person ever arrested for any of these murders was a Jewish boot finisher by the name of John Pizer, known as Leather Apron. He was arrested but later released for lack of evidence. But later still, he had to be taken into police custody again because he was chased through these streets by a lynch mob. because people thought he was Jack the Ripper because he was Jewish. No Englishman could commit these murders, was the thinking at the time. So the point, Charles Warren, but you know, you should have that repeated photograph. So we go now, folks, to the site of the second murder, the second victim actually ripped up. Mary Kelly there was from Ireland. One was from Wolverhampton in the Midlands. One was from Windsor. And one, Elizabeth Stride, she was from Sweden. She was a Swedish woman. And they were all respectable when they started out, but either their husbands had left them or died. And in those days, of course, you know, without social security, if you're on your uppers, you had to do what you had to do to survive. And that meant these women going on the streets and thereby meeting Jack the Ripper. Mary Kelly, she was different actually from the others. She was only 25 and allegedly very good looking. The others were all in their 40s and ravaged with drink. There's no photograph of Mary Kelly alive. It's one of her after Jack the Ripper, it seems to us. But here's a sort of, this is like a sort of computerized, Disneyfied version of her from descriptions. And this is the first place she stayed, the workhouse. You know, the workhouse in those days was a terrible place. It was specifically designed to be so unpleasant that people would prefer to stay on the streets. You know, you had to sleep in these narrow wooden coffin-like boxes filled with filthy, lice-ridden rags. There was drunkenness and screaming going on in there. Today, this is student accommodation. Nothing changed. No, I should know. No, we're going to go up Artillery Passage, folks. Now, I don't know whether Jack the Ripper ever went up here, but if he didn't, you feel rather that he should have done, because this coming up looks like a film set from the Jack the Ripper movie. And it gives you an idea what a lot of London looked like in the depths of World War II and the subsequent redevelopment of the war. Well, we're not going to go to the end though, but we'll turn at the top, we'll turn right to a narrower alleyway, and then carry on here like a hundred yards run back together, turn right at the top. Now, have a look at the left, so coming up over the approach to Artillery Passage, you see a shop run, and as you said, so we're focused on the pub on the corner behind me, the 10 Bells. You know, all the Jack the Ripper victims were known to have drunk in this pub, so it seems likely that they all knew each other. This pub, by the way, for a dozen years, from 1976 to 1988, the centenary of these murders, this pub was known as the Jack the Ripper. For those dozen years, there was constant protest from feminists and other people saying, well, quite rightly really, you know, you're glorifying a serial killer, calling this pub the Jack the Ripper. So in 1988, the landlord relented and it went back to its original name of the 10 Bells. When we finish the tour up there, folks, people do go back to this pub because it's very atmospheric. It's changed very little from the time of Jack the Ripper. And you can just imagine a Jack the Ripper victim sitting in the bar, knocking back the gin. Just to say though, they're not particularly Ripper friendly in there because people go in there and have a look around and don't buy a drink. So if you do go in there, do buy a drink, preferably gin. This pub, by the way, in the church, Christ Church, Spitalfields, and the cattle trough, it's where the blackmailing prostitutes plotted, was all recreated in the last major movie made about Jack the Ripper about 10 years ago. That was a Johnny Depp movie from hell. Anybody see that? It takes on the Royal Prince and Surgeon theory, and they went to a lot of trouble to recreate the sets from old photographs, and you'll recognise the pub, the two pillars, the film, and the church and the cattle trough there. It wasn't filmed here though, it was filmed in Prague in the Czech Republic on a 12-acre site. So the second Ripper victim, that's the second one actually ripped up, Annie Chapman. She was seen drinking in this pub in the early hours of the morning on the 8th of September 1888. In those days you could drink all through the day, all through the night. No licensing laws till World War I. So it's obviously what Annie Chapman was doing. And later she was seen outside the pub here talking to a man. And another witness, Elizabeth Darrell, said she saw Chapman talk to the man. Darrell described the man as about 5'6", well built, stoutish, fair hair, brown moustache. Shabby, genteel looking, she said. Now, do you remember the description of the man seen in Mitre Sq earlier on? It fits exactly the description of the man seen talking to Chapman outside the pub. So it seems very likely to be a good description of the killer. Darrell said she overheard the man say to Chapman, "Will you?" He replied, "Yes." And they walked off together up the road there and turned right into Hanbury Street, where she was found murdered and mutilated. And that's where we go now, folks. So behind you there, to the early 1970s, a bad decade for the Jack Ripper murder sites in the 1970s. Behind you stood number 29 Hanbury Street. It's a very nice sort of 18th century French Huguenot house, very similar to the one that's opposite. You know the French Huguenots, they were Protestants who came over in the 1700s to escape persecution. Very fine silk weavers, built these very nice houses, very desirable in the 18th century, as indeed they are now. I mean, the one in the blue there to my right was set you back about £2 billion. But there were slums in the 1970s, so they demolished the whole block here to build the Watney's Brewery, which itself is now gone. And indeed, there were slums in the 1880s. I mean, number 29 here had 17 people living in it. It was like a tenement. And notice the buildings opposite, there's two doors. The outer door, which would have been there on this side, the outer door was like for a single passageway to go to the backyard. That's where the night soul man would go through to the backyard in the middle of the night to collect the human waste from the cesspit at the back. No flushing toilets in those days. Now obviously nobody wanted to get up in the middle of the night to let the night soul man through. So these doors were usually left unlocked. And the local prostitutes knew this, and they knew it was a good place for them to take a customer, what they called a fourpenny knee trembler. That was a set rate, 4 old pennies, 2 pence in today's money. And it was a set rate because it was either the price of a glass of gin or the price of a bed for the night in a doss house, a homeless person's refuge. You know, all but one of these victims were homeless, living from night to night in doss houses, except the last victim, Mary Kelly, and I'll show you where she lived later on. So it's obviously what Annie Chapman has done. She's met the man outside the pub, brought him down here to Hanbury Street, taken him through the backyard, through the passageway to the backyard, and that's where she was found murdered and mutilated. Again, the throat cut from left to right, again the knife plunge found below, etc, etc. Again, organs missing. But very little blood. And this is true of a lot of these victims, very little blood. And this has led to the speculation that perhaps these murders were committed elsewhere and the bodies later dumped. Not only explaining the lack of blood, but why these murders seem to happen very quickly. You know, somebody passing a scene at a certain time, nothing untoward, 10 minutes later, there's the body all cut up. If you catch that Johnny Depp film from hell, they take on the well-known theory that the victims were picked up in a hansom cab or a carriage, poisoned with grapes in the carriage, because grape stalks are found at several murder spots, and then they were murdered and mutilated in the carriage, and their bodies later dumped. Not only explaining the lack of blood, but why the murders happened so quickly. You have to ask yourself though, you know, in this instance, why would the carriage bother to draw up on the curb and they bothered to take the body through the passageway to the backyard? it doesn't make any sense in this instance. By the way, this murder happened in daylight. It was 5:30 in the morning when the body was found. Because somebody had gone into the yard 10 minutes before, not seen anything. 10 minutes later, there's the body all cut up. Not what you think, is it, for Jack the Ripper's daylight? And you know, there was no fog on any of these murder nights. You know, if you think of Jack the Ripper, think of yellow swirling fog. Plenty of fog in London at the time, before the Clean Air Act of 1956. It just so happened on these particular murder nights, no fog in London, which again is not what you think, is it? So we're going to go now, folks, to our very last stop. This is near the scene of the last murder, Mary Jane Kelly, and the most violent and brutal. Round in a circle from the pub there and the church. And now, behind me, well, till last year actually, there was a service road. It didn't have a name. It didn't have a name since the 1970s. But originally it was called Dorset Street. But they've demolished the whole block a year too late. There was nothing really ancient here. The oldest bit went back to the 50s, I think. But there's a photograph of Dorset Street, which is looking up from right at the bottom to where we are. Yeah, it's taken about the time of the Ripper murder. And just went down Dorset Street here and turn right. Just where the train is. There's an alleyway. Went up there, turn right. Miller's Court. And number 13 at the end, just where the train is, was one roomed flat occupied by Mary Jane Kelly. She was the only one of the Ripper victims to have her own place, albeit just one room. Now, quite late in the morning of the 9th of November 1888, about 10:30, the landlord, John McCarthy, he sends down his assistant, Thomas Boyer, number 13, to collect the rent, because it was 5 weeks overdue. So Thomas Boyer, he goes down there, he knocks on the door, receives no reply. Knocks again, no reply. So he thinks, oh, I know this trick. She's hiding from the rent man, 5 weeks overdue. Now notice on this picture here of number 13, the window frame, well, one of the window panes had been broken just the week before in a fight, and had been stuffed with sacking to block out the draft. So Thomas Boyer, he removes the sacking and he peers in the one-room flat. Well, when his eyes, when they adjusted themselves to the gloom, he saw something he never forgot for the rest of his life. It's what Jack the Ripper had done to Mary Jane Kelly. Now I've got a photograph here of Mary Kelly. It's the only photograph we have of her, alive or dead. And it's the very first crime scene photograph ever taken anywhere in the world. And the police took it because they didn't believe, people would believe, what had happened. So you want to look at Mary Jane Kelly after Jack the Ripper? There you are. They didn't even know whether the cause of death was the throat being cut. Such mutilation was there to the neck. The flesh at the top of the head had been carved down to the skull. The face disfigured, the nose cut off, the eyes gouged out. It was almost as if he was trying to dehumanize her. The breasts were removed, one placed at the top of the head, the other at her feet. The liver removed, placed on the table. Nobody knows what happened to the heart. That was completely gone. And all the innards were strewn around the room like so much obscene Christmas decoration. And that was that. That was the very last anybody had heard from Jack the Ripper. Why did he stop? You know, it's unusual for serial killers to stop unless they're caught or killed. Could it be this particular murder was so horrendous that the mind of the killer collapsed and either he committed suicide or was incarcerated in a lunatic asylum? We don't know. And I don't suppose we'll ever know now. It's over nearly 130 years ago now. Although in 1991, an FBI man called William Urquhart, he did some profiling on the Ripper based on the limited knowledge we have. He thought the killer was about 30 years of age. He thought he was employed because all these murders happened on weekends or bank holidays. He thought he was known to the police beforehand. He didn't think he had medical knowledge, and he thought he was working class because he wasn't fastidious or fussy about going into these dirty, grimy places with these prostitutes. He also thought the killer lived alone. Obviously he's coming back with blood on his hands and clothes, very suspicious, and he thought he was perceived to be a loner by his associates. And he thought he lived right in the centre of these murders. You know, serial killers normally operate from a base, usually their home. They radiate out in a circle. Now, if you take the centre of the circle of these murders, it's Flower and Dean Street, just round the corner to your left. The very centre, that one's yours. Urquhart also thought the killer was likely to have been abused as a child, possibly with the consent of his mother. Now, it just so happens we now know the man living in this area at the time who fitted all those descriptions. And his name was Joseph Barnett. There's Joseph Barnett with the bowler hat. He was 29 years of age, employed in the Billingsgate Fish Market. He lived right in the centre of these murders, just off Brick Lane, around the corner from Flower and Dean Street. Obviously working class. He was perceived to be a loner by his associates, lived alone, no medical knowledge, and indeed had been abused as a child. Now, Joseph Barnett was actually Mary Kelly's boyfriend, not living with her at the time. And the theory about him was he was supposedly in love with Mary Kelly, and he wanted her to stop being a prostitute, but she refused to do this. So it's been speculated he committed these murders to scare her off the streets. And indeed, she was scared of Jack the Ripper. But she persisted in being a prostitute, and it's been suggested in anger and frustration he did this terrible thing to Mary Kelly. Now, if Barnett was Jack the Ripper, he didn't commit suicide, nor was he incarcerated in a lunatic asylum. He died relatively respectably in Shadwell, south of here, in 1926. He was interviewed by the police. There's a description of 5'6", well built, stoutish, fair hair, brown moustache. Remember those descriptions we had earlier? Just exactly Joseph Barnett. For my money, this man was Jack the Ripper. You know, I don't go for these fanciful theories that the killer was Queen Victoria's grandson or surgeon, or Lewis Carroll. No, Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. He's been put in the frame, as has Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's father. You know, a toff would stick out like a sore thumb in this area at the time. Now, it had to be an ordinary working class man who lived in this area, knew the area like the back of his hand, who wouldn't stick out. If not Barnett, somebody like him. No, we'll never know. That's 130 years ago now. And, you know, even if we did know, even if it came to light that so-and-so was irrefutably, categorically Jack the Ripper, I don't think now in the public mind we thought of it as the person, the man. It'd always be this mythic prowling the fog-ridden streets of Whitechapel in 1888. Yeah, so Dawson Street, you know, till last year, we went back to 1674. You're a year too late. There's no old buildings here, they only went back to the 50s. Now we've got a rough orientation of where Mary Kelly died, but this time next year, we'll be lost in a big office complex, so one last look at it. Well, that's the tour. I hope you enjoy, well, perhaps enjoy is the wrong word. I hope you found it fascinating. Now I'm going to go to the end of the road here to Moorgate East Tube, where you can either get the tube, one stop on to Tower Hill, where we started, you know, where the Roman Emperor was, or you could walk back top of the road here in 5-10 minutes, you know, from that church. People do like to check out the Atherton pub, 10 Bells. You know, that road just before 10 Bells to the right will take you up to Brick Lane, known as Bangor Town, the curry capital of London. People do like to go back to Brick Lane for a nice hot curry after a river tour. They're really good. So it's up to you. I'm going to walk to the end of the road here, folks. So, any more of those photographs of it? Oh, there we go. So, you're coming with me. We're going to check.